Well, welcome back. This is a new generation of legacy leaders. These are the folk that picked up the baton from the founders in the 1970 and up until the mid to late 70s. All of us came under the tenure of Bill Brooks and Barbara Mahone, who are the two people who took over from the original founders. And it was under Bill and Barbara that the first annual conference of National Black MBA Association was held in Detroit in 1979. And we have two members up here who joined the organization in 1979. Lee Nunnery, Jolene Spencer Oladande. The rest of us came in later. In 1980, it was Angela Dowd Burton and Essie Mason Purnell and myself. In the back, we have folk who came in later in the 80s, and they will talk specifically about programs that they helped to build and bring to the organization, and those same programs exist today. And so we're going to start with you, Lee. As I recall, you were called the hip-hop president. This was like 1980. We all remember when Lee was president and he was making a speech at a major event like today's luncheon. And he got up there and started rapping. And we said, who is this young man? So tell us a little bit about a role that you played at Black MBA. And you know, a lot of us old timers still believe that you were the best president the organization ever had. And we didn't pay you not one dime because we had no pay, no money, and we had no paid staff. But it was under these folks' tenure that we did open our first office, and hopefully, especially our VP of admin down there, I think you had something to do with opening that new office in 1988. So why don't you talk a little bit about your role, Lee?
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think, without the pay, I realized I was building equity in my career, in a future with people that I'm still associated with 4 decades later. I joined 3 months after I came out of business school in 1979. Beverly Hawkins, God rest her soul, recruited me and said, why don't you come and join us? And don't you know, after that first meeting, I had a job with her.
Of course.
And I ran programming in the Chicago chapter. Later on, became chapter president, on into the national organization, national president for 4 years. You mentioned the money, and I'll go there. Part of the job was trying to build enough of a base after Barbara, Bill, and others had come together so that we could sustain ourselves. And we're here at a conference where there are thousands of people. Well, there was a time we had to go out on the street and pull people in just to get them to, because nobody really knew what this could be. And I think what's fascinating is when you look at the work you do, programming, newsletters. We didn't have email, so everything was either licking stamps or licking envelopes, calling people, sneaking during the workday to get some MBA work done. But it was all worth it because I think we knew we were trying to put something together. We just didn't know what it would be. My roles have been not only varied, but the one thing the Black MBAs gave me was an opportunity to stretch out way beyond what I did as a day job. I was a banker, I did some other things, but what really grabbed me was the ability to speak to a large audience or to bring people together for a common cause. And those skills are still exhibiting themselves in my daily work today. So I'm grateful for the Black MBA Association, and I'm still rapping a little bit on the side.
All right, still rapping. Okay, so Jolene, you joined in 1979 as well. Share with us. I was thinking about the newsletter that Thelma and Juanita talked about earlier. I know you spent some time with the newsletter.
I did it that. Like Lee, I was recruited, but I was recruited by Bill Rodney, and he is one of the early founders. He recently passed, and we were all together, or several of us were together at his memorial service where we read a resolution. But I remember one of the first meetings was with him in his home, and a number of other people were there. And I said, man, this is a great group. I got to become part of it. And very much like Lee, once you raise your hand, it's like it's stuck like glue to something. I had a journalism background and volunteered to help with the newsletter, and probably spent the next maybe, I don't know, 6 years or so working on the newsletter after Angela, who actually was working on it first and then transitioned. But that kind of pull into the organization, and in that case at a national level, because we were trying to get it out to people outside of the Chicago area, which is where I was based with Lee, kind of under his leadership, both as chapter president and also then as national president. You're just more involved.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like many of us on the that served in the chapter level,
Mm-hmm.
you served in the chapter level on a committee, and then from the committee you went to a vice president, then you went to the chapter president, then you went to the board, and it was like, okay, one of these days I'll get off, but not really. So on the board, after I served as national newsletter editor, I then served as national secretary, national and vice president of administration. So it was, and then it was up to that point at which the organization said, we have now grown to a point where we need more. We need something different. We can no longer be a volunteer organization. And during that period of the early 80s, our organization went from 5 chapters, well, actually 2 to 3, and I'm always confused who came in first and second on that one. I know Chicago was not first or second. Well, I think Chicago was second or third. But from 5 to 20. And it was at that point where, in a 10-year or so, 10 to 12-year period, we knew it was time to take that next step into being a professional organization. And our first step was to hire a management company. And from there, the organization continued to grow and develop. So I have played every role in the Black MBA Association practically that there could be, from not only being a volunteer to towards the end of my formal work period. I actually worked for the organization. I did get paid. I didn't get paid much, but I did get paid. But I served also on one of the marketing teams during the conference, and then with the development, writing, and editing of one of our legacy books.
Thank you, Jolene. Okay, next are Angela Dow Burton and Essie Mason Purnell, both of whom joined the organization in 1980, as well as I did. Angela, tell us about your role at National Black.
Well, National Black MBA Association is extremely important to me. I am one that was looking early in my career. I just graduated in 79 with my MBA. I started a new position at Sun Company and ran into a young lady named Renee Chestnut who said, well, why don't you come to a Black MBA Association meeting? And I said, okay, I'll check it out. And the first meeting I went, Tony Braxton was president. I asked so many questions. He came back after the meeting and said, who brought her to this meeting? And so from there, I just volunteered because I wanted to help develop the agenda that he had. But the following year, he stepped down and I was elected president. So I said, okay, we got this. Um, After that year, I went on to the board as a past president. That's how we sort of expanded our board of operations, and was delighted to meet other MBAs from across the country who shared the values and certainly the interest in developing careers, but also a commitment to an organization that we thought would move not only our careers but the next generations forward. And so it was an extraordinary time. I did learn about some of the coercive strategies that were used around the board meetings, and later on began to speak up. When I was rolling off the board, I said, it's been nice knowing everyone. And then Chuck Grant, who was president at that time, said, no, we want you to be editor of the national newsletter. And I said, okay, up until this point, I had only written papers for school. And I said, sure, I can do a newsletter and figure it out. So I interviewed people, I took pictures, I did learn how to do the layout. I even had copies made. I folded them, I counted them. And based on the chapter memberships around the country, I mailed each chapter a copy of the newsletter. I recall at one point, hearing one person say so many times I'll get around to it, that I actually did the graphics in the newsletter. I wrote and designed a round to it, and I said, here you are. Now that you have the round to it, get things done. And so there was just that commitment early on that we were building and we were striving to make a contribution to that community.
Okay, Miss Sassy, you want to pick up the story?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much, Catherine. Unlike Angela, I was not shy and I talked a lot. I graduated from Roosevelt University in Chicago with an MBA in 1979. My company moved me to Atlanta in 1980, and someone came over and said, you've got an MBA. We are putting together this chapter for Atlanta and we need your help. So we started working on it. And in the middle of all of that, we decided that there's a conference or something going on. We don't have anybody who has any money to send anyone. So we just decided to do some other things, like let's raise some money. So we're having parties, doing those kinds of things to raise some money so that we can get started. And we did. And we finally sent someone to the first conference in 1981. 1983 in 1982, I was elected president of the chapter. I think I went from volunteer to president. I don't think I had another role before that. And during that time, we knew that we were going to have a conference in 1983, and we had no money. Beverly Hawkins, God rest her soul, was in charge of the national office, if there's such a thing as national office at that time. She came down to Atlanta. We had no money for anything like a hotel. We stayed with each other. We all became good friends. We met with Clay Kroon and several other people, went to Coca-Cola and asked for some money. And eventually, we got $50,000 from them. I talked to my company, which was AT&T. I said, I am the president of this organization. We're having a conference in 1983 here. I need some money. So they came up with some money. They eventually became the first Silver Star, I believe, recipient. I believe they were the first. Silver Torch, I'm sorry, thank you. I believe they were the first to do that based upon what they had done. The bottom line is that we learned that we have not because we ask not. And so when we started asking people, people responded. And because we were all volunteers, we did what we needed to do because it was necessary to do so. Eventually, I moved back to Chicago. I became vice president of the national organization. I became national secretary of the organization. I became whatever I needed to be because that was what people needed to have done at that particular time. Never once stopped to think that I should not ask. I shall never forget working in Chicago on a second go around when I believe it might have been the 1992 conference. I asked my company to give us some money, and I also asked them to send my entire team to the conference. A team of over 20 people that they paid for to come to that conference. And I told my boss, you need to be there too. I said, this is a National Black MBA conference. You're a white man, you need to be at this conference to see what we do. And so the whole idea is that we need to speak for ourselves to say what it is we need because we never know what people will give us until we ask.
One of the things that I think the modern younger members of the organization may not realize is that we had no staff, so we had nobody who could put on a national conference. And Wayne, as I recall, you were co-chair of the national conference in Philadelphia. Would you share a little bit about what was required of a volunteer to put on this conference?
Thank you, Catherine. Indeed. I had joined the organization in 1980 and was living in Nashville working at Fisk and then moved to Atlanta. And so as a part of the Atlanta chapter, I was involved in the conference that was held that year in 83, and I moved to Philadelphia in 84. So in 1984, I volunteered in the Philadelphia chapter, started meeting, the members, and I became, I believe, director of communications. I used to print mailing labels so you could mail whatever we had that went out to the members. And 1987 came around, and Philadelphia had been selected to host the conference. And at the time, there were no volunteers to run that conference. And finally, I think National sent someone to meet with us and say, you got to come up with a chair. And so Vern Mitchell and I volunteered as co-chairs. And the theme that year was Changing Horizons, the Challenge of Leadership. And we put on a conference, all volunteer committees. National would show up and sort of beat up on you a little bit, or you go to the national board meeting and get beat up on a little bit. But by and large, we had to put on a conference in a city, and at the time there was no convention center, there were no convention quality hotels. There was a hotel that's now the Sheraton over at 16th and Race. And that's where we set up shop, but we had great venues. So we had events at the Franklin Institute, Dancing Under Ben Franklin. We had events at the Botanical Garden. This was, September, October, the weather was nice. And then that year, Dr. J was retiring, and he was our keynote speaker. So talking about ending and having a conference, first of all, that netted $500,000. We had a great fundraising team. We had great support from the members and actually didn't lose anybody along the way. It was a great event, but again, no national office. Everything was done and we were successful. We had a party room in the lobby of the hotel that ran all night. And as a result, we got 6 marriages out of that conference. So it was very successful. And I have been a member ever since and have been active. I've attended meetings in other cities, chapter meetings in Dallas and other places. So this is a network of professionals that you're not going to find anyplace else.
Okay, Miss Barbara. This is Barbara Bostic. Barbara is best known in the organization for the role you played with the building of the Scholarship Fund. So would you speak to that, please?
Yes. In 83, I joined Chicago chapter. In 84, I'm the founder, one of the founders of the local state chapter and the chartered president. 84, Karen and I, our chapter was approved for full chapter in San Francisco. Before that year was over, in 84, a young man by the name of Steve Lewis asked me to work with him because Barbara Stubblefield was on the board and was co-director with him. She passed away from cancer. So from 84, for 16 or 17 years after that, I was responsible for the scholarship program. Phenomenal program. We gave millions of dollars, and I know it was millions of dollars because it's been calculated, to the scholarships for MBA programs. Later on, I asked Dr. William Qualls if he would start a PhD program. So we started giving away PhD scholarships. Most rewarding program, phenomenal program ever, I think, ever. And that just went on and on and on. And so I enjoyed doing that. We had during the early years, we started a foundation. There were about 5 of us, Pat Williams, myself, Steve Lewis, and a couple others started the foundation. It did not come to fruition. But a few years, not too many years ago, Steve Lewis and I and a couple others, Bill Qualls, well, Steve wasn't in that portion of it. It was Bill Qualls started a foundation again. So that went on a few years, and we don't have that foundation now. But we did have and start raising money for that foundation. But I have been involved for a long time. I was on the board. I was national secretary, vice president of marketing. Like I think Angela said, they don't let you go. They keep saying, can you do this? Will you do that? And then for a while, it was vice president. I don't think it was fundraising or I don't remember exactly the title or administration. And so I did that for a while. But I spent most of the time on that program. But I've been involved also with leaders. And that was in New York when they had all the students there. And then a year or two after that, they actually started Leaders of Tomorrow. Well, I've been involved in some way with leaders ever since. Now the Dayton chapter, I revamped the Dayton chapter president again. And we'll talk about it later because this young man was responsible for me going back in and getting help. And now we have a great Dayton chapter again. We now have Leaders of Tomorrow. It's doing outstandingly well. And I write grants to raise money and give money to that program. I want to say one thing. That young man sitting next to you, his name is Leroy Nunnery. When he was chair of the board, he went to different chapters and helped them out. And the one thing he did, if you were interested in learning how to raise funds, he drove to Dayton, Ohio. I don't know how many others. It seemed like I continued to raise funds for the Dayton chapter. I still am. But because of him, I'm still on that journey. The fundraising that he helped do, I've gone back since for classes for philanthropy and other things. But I belong to a lot of organizations. I raise a lot of money. Don't like to write grants, but I write them because it's money to give back to students or Leaders of Tomorrow. We even give away scholarship dollars on the local level with the Leaders of Tomorrow. So it's just we've done a lot. I'll finish by saying that Catherine, you and I talked last week and talked about how many years, 40 plus years, Steve Lewis, Catherine LeBlanc, and I have been working on a national or local level for 40 plus years. So we all at this table have that commitment and passion to continue what the founder started back in 70 and 72 when it was incorporated. And I thank you for that.
Thank you, Barbara. Next, we have Karen Anderson Moon. Karen is the person who is most thought about when it comes to Leaders of Tomorrow. Please share with us, Karen, your journey and getting funding for that first funding for Leaders of Tomorrow.
Yes, Karen Anderson Moon. I have to acknowledge people from Rochester, New York, because when we started the Western New York chapter, there were people that weren't even a part of our organization that mentioned or talked about mentoring young people from our community, young people that probably would be going in a different direction entirely unless they were mentored, unless they were encouraged by people that they knew that expected more of them. And so we made up, and it wasn't my idea to call it Leaders of Tomorrow. It was a young man who was running a fraternity office that created that name for the program. But we created a set of criteria, and we went to the schools and to guidance counselors and asked for them to identify students that had at least a C average or a GPA of C or better, and that they would recommend. And we judged their work, and they got points. And the students, after, I think it was about 6 months of activities they had to do, but the highest number of points were the students that won a trip to the national conference. And that was their reward, was going to the national conference with us for the National Black MBA Association conference. We had $0. We put them in our cars. Fortunately, we drove from Rochester, New York to Philadelphia. We had folks that we knew that we could stay at their houses because we couldn't afford to put them in hotels. But that was the introduction of the Leaders of Tomorrow program. I think we had 9 young people that we brought with us. And Lois Williams was the other, had been the first Western New York chapter president. I was the second Western New York chapter president, and we were recognized as a chapter in 1984. That was when we brought our first students. And 1980, I can't even remember the year, but after that, some years after that, not that long, I went to work for M&M's. And M&M's produces M&M's, Snickers, Milky Way, all kinds of things. And my boss, I worked on Snickers, and my boss covered all the candy for M&M's in the country. Happened to be a black man. His name was Alfred Poe. And I told him about the Leaders of Tomorrow program, and he thought it was a great idea, mentoring young people through our chapters and encouraging them with a national trip and recognition. And he encouraged, this is a good idea that might be something that a national candy company would be interested in. And from that time, which I'm going to say must have been 1989 when I went to work, because I worked for them from 89 until 94. But Audrey Dillard-Hines worked for M&M's, and she was the Mars person who basically nurtured the program with funding, whatever she wanted, whatever she decided was the budget that they needed, it was provided, and Al supported it. And so the Leaders of Tomorrow program was funded basically by M&M's from that time, and I think until Audrey retired. Yes. So quite some time.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Karen. And I'm just really loving this walk down memory lane. And I wanted Jesse to go last because Jesse did so much to codify what has been going on with this organization for its first 45 years. And even though Jesse was a member back in 1979, Houston chapter, his primary role at that time was to make sure that ExxonMobil funded National Black MBA Association, which was a big deal. But then Jesse became president of the organization after he retired. And he had a very, very successful long-term career at ExxonMobil. But tell us, Jesse, about why it is that you thought it was so important to capture the legacy of this organization and some of the things that you were able to do while you were president. We know what you did in terms of getting the money in the late 70s, but share with us about capturing the legacy.
Thanks, Catherine. Let me start off, though, by a big thank you to all of you, because it was your shoulders that I and others who came behind me for standing on. And so we do appreciate everything that you all did. But before I answer your questions well, I have to kind of piggyback your comments. Alpo and I became neighbors 40 years later. And who would have thought that Al and I were connected? And Audrey Hine was actually my boss, but Audrey was a chair of the board of Black MBA when I was the interim CEO. But I came on board as the interim CEO with the intent of being in that role for 6 months. That was the commitment. That was the contract that I signed. And then 6 months later, they wanted me to do another 6 months. And so I was there for 5 years. And one of the things we wanted to do was show respect to those who came before us. Too many of our organizations talk about it, but very few of them actually document what that history was and what the legacy was and the sacrifice that was made by those who came before us. So even though I knew I was in an interim role, I took on the job as if I was going to be there forever. And one of the things that really impressed me early on was I went to a conference, and we had what we call the Blue Blazer ceremony. And so for those of you who know, that's when the LOT students are paraded on stage, and you see them kind of go from being looked at as a child to an adult. And that Blue Blazer ceremony touched me. And so I took the work of Eminem Mars, and we created $1 million endowment to honor and support LOT. So that was the first thing that I thought was important, to make sure that our future was solidified as it related to LOT. The other thing was we're all MBAs, right? And so we're supposed to make smart decisions about our finances. And so the other thing that I thought was important for me to do is to make a good decision about where we were located. Our office was in Chicago, not the least expensive city in the United States. And so we moved the office from Chicago to Atlanta. So we went from paying rent in Chicago to owning our facility in Atlanta. So the mortgage in Atlanta was less than the rent we paid in Chicago. So we think we made a good decision for the future of the organization when we did that. But all of that's great, but it's a snapshot in time. And one of the other things we wanted to do is make sure that when we're gone, that those coming behind us will still have something that they can read and understand in terms of what Black MBA is all about. So I had two people who were kind of my co-CEOs, Captain LeBron and a guy named Bill Wells who was on the board. And so I got Catherine and Bill to take on a project of documenting the history of the Black MBA. And so we put together this book. This book says, Celebrating the Legacy, Empowering the Future. So publicly, Catherine, I'm going to say to you again, thank you very much. And so if you don't have a copy of this book, see Catherine, I'm sure she can find a copy somewhere. But in this book, you can go from day one to whenever this book is published and get a real good appreciation of who we are as an organization. And I felt really proud of the fact that I was part of it. I felt proud of the fact that it happened because of me. And we don't always take credit for things that we do, and we shouldn't always take credit for what we do. We should just do it. But I'm going to take credit for it.
Indeed. Thank you, Jesse. And thanks to each one of you. You've done such a wonderful job of picking up the baton from our founders, whom we heard from earlier today. And just the thing that is so wonderful about coming to conference is just about every program that the National Black MBA Association currently has came under our tenure, whether it is case competition, whether it is the scholarship program, whether it is the career fair. And the career fair has been expanded in so many different ways. The Career Success Network, the Employment Network. And so we owe Leadership Institute, which our dear friend Beverly Hawkins and I co-created almost 20 years ago. And it is wonderful to see our legacy in real life. And we see it every time we come to conference. And we see these young people going, trying to find themselves a job. And we know that we have done something pretty fantastic. So thank you, thank you, thank you.